Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Prince George's County Memorial Library System's virtual programs. We are broadcasting to you tonight from Prince George's County, Maryland, and we are very, very pleased and honored to have with us very special partners from around the state. They include the Enoch Pratt Free Library from Baltimore, the Howard County Library, the Carroll County Public Library, the Anne Arundel County Public Library, and also the Calvert Library. We are really grateful to our partners in the state for helping spread the word about this really awesome event, which is the second episode of Authors for Truth. This is a series made possible by the PGCMLS Foundation. Tonight's event is being broadcast live on Crowdcast, Periscope, Facebook, and YouTube. If you'd like to help us spread the word, please share those feeds far and wide. The archival video will be available for on-demand viewing following the conclusion of the program on PGCMLS's platforms. And if you have any questions tonight, please type them into the chat box or comment feed wherever you're tuning in from, and we'll get to those questions in the Q&A session towards the end of the program. We remind you that if you have the ability to support the PGCMLS Foundation, that there is a link for you to do that on the bottom of your screen in green or in the chat boxes wherever you're viewing from. And without further ado, we'll invite Melanie Townsend Diggs, who is the area manager for the South area of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, who will be leading our program.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you to everyone here. Good evening and welcome to everybody watching on our various platforms. This is our second Authors for Truth series program, as Nick said. The Authors for Truth series features authors who have written works on the topics of social justice and equity. The conversations that we'll be having throughout the series will be a way to speak to the importance of these topics in our library system and surrounding communities, even in our nation and our world. Since we are virtual now, it can spread out everywhere. An awesome added note, and I just had to add this, is that the name Authors for Truth is derived from our African American Reading Room and Innovation Space at the Oxon Hill branch in the South area of the county, where I am, as Nick said, the South area manager. So the Sojourner Truth Room is closed now because we know that all libraries are closed. But hopefully in the near future, we'll be back open, and we would love to have you physically in that space. And brings me to Dr. Bonner, who is here tonight. We thought we would have our first Authors for Truth series featuring his colleague, Dr. Richard Bell, in our physical library at the Oxon Hill branch, but it went over virtually and it went over well. And now we have a colleague of Dr. Richard Bell, Dr. Christopher Bonner, is here with us tonight to talk about his book, Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship. Dr. Bonner is an assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland, College Park. And we just appreciate him being here tonight. A little bit about the book. I like this quote that I found, Dr. Bonner. It says, "The book is full of riveting stories about race and the American political imagination, of how freedom and citizenship took root in a hostile legal soil, and about the enduring power of collective struggle, however rancorous the schisms or how high the racist obstacles." I just love that quote because I think it does give great information about what your book entails and tries to do. So without further ado, we'll hear from Dr. Christopher Bonner.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks to everybody for taking the time to come out and listen to learn a little bit about my work tonight. And thank you to the folks at the PG Library System for putting this together, for giving me this opportunity to talk about my book and to talk about some really important issues in contemporary American life. I want to try to share some slides. And we'll see if that's working. Is this okay? So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'll outline the big ideas that are driving my book. I'll tell a story, hopefully a riveting story, about some of the forms of Black politics that I explore in the project. And I'll offer some thoughts about how my scholarship connects with ideas about Black politics today. So the title for this particular talk is, as you see, Runaways or Citizens Claimed as Such. I'll start with a question. What does citizenship mean to you? What does it mean to say a person is a citizen? Typically, when I ask these questions, I get a wide range of answers. People might talk about specific rights that citizenship confers. They might mention broader benefits of citizen status, things like access to the law or access to the physical space of a nation or a community. They might talk about intangible things like belonging. It's important that there are so many different ways to approach this question. Citizenship remains contested ground. Today, at the same time that people are trying to claim particular rights as citizens, others are trying to deny certain groups access to the benefits of citizenship. It's also important that even when people don't agree on what exactly citizenship means, they tend to have strong ideas about it. People do seem to agree that citizenship is a significant marker of a person's legal identity. They agree that it offers tangible and intangible benefits. People generally agree that citizenship is a thing worth fighting for. None of these qualities of citizenship are new. Since the beginning of the United States, people have disagreed about the precise terms of citizenship, even when they agreed that it was a thing that was worth fighting for. My book tells a series of stories about Black Americans pushing their way into that fight in the early 19th century. I write about free Black people who made claims about what citizenship meant in hopes of changing the legal terms of their lives in the United States. In their words and actions, Black people made radical arguments about citizenship, and they did critical work to shape the nation's legal development, even as those in positions of power denied them a voice in the lawmaking process. A little context about Black life in the early 19th century. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, several northern states took steps to gradually abolish slavery. New York's gradual abolition law, which you're seeing a piece of here, said that enslaved people who were born after July 4th, 1799 would be free once they reached age 25 for women or age 28 for men. These kinds of laws slowly created a free Black population in northern states. But at the same time, lawmakers limited Black freedom in profound ways. The US Congress excluded Black men from the military, and many states similarly barred Black men from militias. Ohio required free Black people to put up a $500 bond before they could settle in the state. New York allowed Black men to vote only if they owned $250 worth of real estate. This equates to about $10,000 in current money. Faced with these restrictions, Black people turned to citizenship in pursuit of justice. The word citizen appeared 11 times in the original US Constitution, and you can see here some of its uses. One of the most significant that I've highlighted is that the Constitution protects an undefined set of rights, a set of privileges and immunities for a citizen. The document implied that citizenship could be an important factor in determining a person's legal life, but it didn't name the obligations of the status. It didn't list the privileges or immunities. It also didn't say who could be a citizen. This uncertainty was powerful for African American activists. No law said that Black people could not be citizens, and so they insisted that they were, and they demanded legal protections under the status. Citizenship became a flexible and potent tool for Black activists. And when they claimed rights as citizens, they contributed to ongoing conversations about the relationships among individuals and governments in the US. So this is the process that I refer to in my book's title. Black folks were remaking the Republic. They were doing work that could change the nation's legal structures. One of the first things that comes to mind for many people when they think about citizenship is the right to vote. And this was true for the folks that I write about. One group of Black activists said the right to vote was indispensable to the protection, prosperity, and happiness of the citizen. Suffrage was critical to Black people's political concerns. But Black politics was complex in the 19th century, as it is now, and folks had concerns far beyond formal political access. I'm going to tell a story about a man named William Dixon, and this story offers another angle on Black politics. Dixon's story helps us to look beyond the vote. It offers a fuller sense of the strategies and objectives of African American politics in the early 19th century. William Dixon's name emerged in the historical record after he was arrested in New York City on a spring morning in 1837. Dixon had left his home on the Bowery, headed to work, when a stranger grabbed him and brought him to face a judge at City Hall. Arriving in the courtroom, the stranger made his claim. The black man who called himself William Dixon was actually a fugitive slave named Jake. Allegedly, Jake had run away from Baltimore Dr. Walter Allender 5 years earlier in 1832. So in court, the slave catcher, the man who had been hired to find a fugitive, he referred to Dixon as Allender's Jake. So this is a man called Jake who was allegedly the property of Dr. Allender. So he's Allender's Jake. Authorities brought Dixon to a cell in the crumbling jail called Bridewell, and they held him there for a week. Then on the morning of April 12th, 2 sheriffs escorted him from Bridewell to City Hall for another hearing before Judge Richard Riker. Under New York law, a single judge could decide whether an alleged fugitive would remain free or be sent into bondage. Judge Riker had a reputation for being a friend to slave owners. He had frequently ruled in their favor and allowed alleged fugitives to be taken to the South. Standing before Judge Riker inside of New York's City Hall, the accused man protested his arrest. He insisted that his name was William Dixon. And he said this: "It is hard, Your Honor. It is hard to be thus treated in this land of liberty. I'm an innocent man. I'm a free man. It is hard to be torn from my family and thrust into prison like a dog. I demand justice of Your Honor." Judge Riker called for a recess to decide the man's fate, and the sheriffs took Dixon by the arms to escort him back to Bridewell. New York City Hall stands today as it did on that April afternoon in the middle of an 8-acre park in Lower Manhattan. I have a few pictures that I'm showing here from a research trip. When I was in grad school, I realized that City Hall in New York is the same building now that it was in 1837, and so I went and took a tour. After Dixon's hearing on April 12th, the sheriffs prepared to lead him across the park to Bridewell. Flanking the captive, they walked down a grand staircase toward the building's main entrance. But as they ushered Dixon towards the doors of City Hall, they would have looked through the large windows that lined the front of the building, and they would have seen a massive crowd waiting outside. During the hearing, more than 1,000 African Americans had gathered on City Hall Plaza. The sheriffs were apparently unconcerned, but as soon as they stepped outside, the crowd surged forward. Several people attacked the sheriffs with wooden clubs. A woman standing at the front of the crowd pulled a knife from under her dress and handed it to Dixon. At first, Dixon wasn't sure what to do while these strangers fought for his freedom, but he overcame his shock and ran west toward Broadway, then turned north to seek shelter in the busy city streets. The crowd continued to fight with the authorities. One official ran outside to support the sheriffs, but according to one source, a strapping Negro wench grabbed him in a chokehold, and a group of young black men pretty well pummeled him and tore the coat completely off his back. Meanwhile, Dixon kept moving north along Broadway. A man on horseback tried to stop him, but Dixon's new escort, several black men armed with clubs, protected the fleeing prisoner. When he reached Duane Street, just a few blocks from City Hall, Dixon opted to take cover. He ducked into a coal cellar to wait out his pursuers. But his freedom there was short-lived. A few hours later, a witness tipped off authorities, and they stormed into the cellar, seized Dixon, and carted him back to jail. So what you're looking at here on this map of Lower Manhattan, the black dot is City Hall, the green dot is Bridewell, and the red dot is where Dixon stopped and was eventually apprehended. The attempt to rescue William Dixon reflected an important thread in Black and anti-slavery politics of this period. The white abolitionist Henry Clark Wright was dismayed that alleged fugitives had to work harder to prove their cases than alleged slave owners did. Wright said, "Here is the great difficulty in all cases of runaways or citizens claimed as such. The whole burden of proof is thrown on the colored man." One Black New Yorker argued that if the citizen of a free state was claimed as a slave, he or she should be entitled to a jury trial to determine their status. Vocal Black and white activists insisted that alleged fugitive slaves were citizens. and they insisted that citizenship must protect free people from being sent into bondage. This rhetoric was intended to urge lawmakers to enact measures that would defend an individual's freedom. But the reality was that William Dixon was held captive by a legal system designed to preserve Black slavery. The US Constitution empowered slave owners to reclaim fugitives who fled to another state. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 said slave owners could cross state lines to pursue runaways, and theoretically, it also allowed them to arrest free Black Northerners who they accused of being fugitives. The simple fact that enslaved people were so valuable meant that Black Northerners lived in a precarious freedom that might be seized mistakenly by slave catchers or maliciously by kidnappers. Kidnapping endangered all Black Northerners, and that helps to explain why so many people gathered on City Hall Plaza to try to rescue William Dixon. Black New Yorkers had a history of organizing to defend their freedom. In 1835, an interracial group of abolitionists established the New York Committee of Vigilance, or the NYCV. They called for new laws to protect free Black people, and at the same time, they aided known fugitives who had come north looking for safety. They called this work practical abolition. They were doing concrete things to fight slavery and the dangerous implications of slavery, the threat that slavery posed to free people. Samuel Cornish was a leader in the New York Committee of Vigilance, the NYCV, and he was also the editor of the Colored American, a newspaper that printed its first issue just a few weeks before Dixon's arrest. Cornish might have thought that he had fortuitous timing because he ended up with a lot of dramatic events to cover in his early issues. Like others in the Vigilance Committee, Cornish said alleged fugitives should have the protection of jury trials. But one of the most interesting things about his writing from this time is that Cornish was extremely critical of the violent attempt to liberate William Dixon. Cornish said the crowd was nothing more than a multitude of illiterate people. From his perspective, these folks weren't acting in a calculated way in pursuit of progress. Instead, the crowd had become mere subjects of passion. There was some legitimacy to Cornish's concerns. There were NYCV lawyers leading Dixon's defense. The hope was that these lawyers would convince the judge to grant Dixon a jury trial, and that decision might set a precedent for other lawmakers to follow. Cornish doubted that a mob who rescued Dixon could have the same legal potential. But beyond his concerns about political tactics, Cornish was particularly outraged that African Americans had done something he felt was so uncivil. He was displeased, and he made it very clear that he was displeased that women had played such prominent roles in the attempted rescue. He said those activist women had degraded themselves, and he added this: "We begged their husbands to keep them at home for the time to come and find some better occupation for them." Cornish addressed this message to the thoughtless part of our colored citizens. He promoted narrow ideas about who could do meaningful, productive Black political work. Really, what he promoted were narrow ideas about what Black political work was or could be. Black women were often denied the chance to make their voices heard in Black newspapers and public meetings in the 19th century. Men like Cornish had restrictive ideas about gender. They thought politics wasn't appropriate for women. But to me, this is one of the things that's really fascinating about the attempted rescue. This kind of politics offered a clear opportunity for Black women to express their ideas in public. I like thinking about the woman who stood at the front of the crowd during the rescue, the woman who reached under her dress and pulled out a knife for William Dixon. She did that because she thought it would help secure his freedom. Maybe she relished this opportunity to step outside of what many people thought was proper women's work. Or maybe she had done this several times before. Maybe she had long ago rejected Cornish's ideas about acceptable women's behavior. It's tough to know this woman's activist history. We don't even know her name. But what we do know is important. She made a choice to take a critical role in Dixon's rescue. And none of the people who were in the crowd stood in her way. Black women carved out opportunities to make their voices heard, despite some people's efforts to silence them. This woman's actions reflect some important truths about the attempted rescue. African Americans believed Dixon deserved a fair hearing, and they were convinced that the legal structures that were in place would not provide it. The mob action was about defending Dixon's freedom, but it was also about more than any one single Black person. Attacking sheriffs and judges in order to liberate an alleged fugitive was a protest against the legal structures that imperiled all Black people's freedom. Breaking the law was a critical form of Black politics. Through their actions, the crowd outside of City Hall added their voices to those calling for a different legal order in the US, a legal order that would protect Black freedom as robustly as it defended slave owners' property rights. Breaking laws was one way Black activists highlighted injustice and demanded legal protections as citizens. And so despite what Samuel Cornish wrote, these folks were far from thoughtless. This is one way I see my work aligning with some of the issues that have been in the news in the past few weeks. People across the country have gathered to protest police brutality, motivated in part by a video that shows the killing of George Floyd. Some of these protests have involved various forms of violence, and many vocal figures, including President Obama, have criticized protesters who do not fit with their ideas about acceptable forms of Black politics. We saw arguments like this about Black protest strategies after uprisings in Baltimore and Ferguson in 2014 and 2015. Again, in those cases, police officers killed unarmed Black people, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Michael Brown in Ferguson, and people took to the streets to denounce long-standing, unchecked police brutality. At the time, many observers condemned those movements as violent, destructive, unruly, or unproductive. We can see a couple of examples of this in the Washington Post. Peaceful protest shifts focus back to death of Freddie Gray, suggesting that violence wasn't expressing outrage about Freddie Gray's killing. Or a column headline that begins with the premise, "Rioting makes no sense." But the violence we saw in 2014 and 2015, and the violence we've seen in the past few weeks, is only senseless to people who don't try to make sense of it. Violent forms of protest often reflect protesters' political thought. My sense is that right now, people have been more open to thinking critically about violence and protest than they were in 2015. I see people invoking Martin Luther King's statement that a riot is the language of the unheard, almost as often as I see people using King to discourage any and all kinds of violence. But still, vocal, prominent figures issue blanket condemnations of violence in politics. I see at least two problems with this kind of statement. First, this criticism obscures the fact, the truth, that much of the violence we've seen in recent weeks is sparked by police violently suppressing protests and protesters trying to defend themselves against militarized police forces. Second, I worry that this criticism arms the enemies of change. When people set fire to police stations or cop cars, it's clear that they're expressing rage about a system that allows officers to kill Black people with impunity. Violent protest doesn't draw attention away from political concerns, but the criticism of violent protest can. And to me, people who insist on denouncing certain forms of Black protest sound a bit like conservative commentators who try to limit Black politics to the forms they feel are acceptable. If we're interested in advancing racial justice, rather than criticizing particular forms of protest, we should continue trying to understand the concerns underlying violent, law-breaking politics. The project of racial justice is better served by amplifying the reasons for Black rage rather than its results. This is the kind of work I try to do in my scholarship, asking questions about why people turn to violence in the effort to rescue William Dixon. People turn to violence because they understood that William Dixon was a Black man who was held captive by a legal system that was designed and intended to promote the interests of slave owners, to enhance and expand the institution of slavery. If we can see political thought and political expression in the violent and unruly attempt to rescue Dixon, we should try to do the same for violent, unruly forms of contemporary politics. Violence might be protest. Lawbreaking can be politics. We should ask thoughtful questions about the roots of particular political forms. Why might Black Americans choose certain avenues of political expression? What forms of Black thought are represented in the collective public acts of lawbreaking that we see? Making sense of these political acts can lead us to the truth that certain legal structures need to be broken in order to bring people closer to justice. Turning back to Dixon's story. In the days after the failed rescue attempt, Dixon's trial continued. His counsel called a number of witnesses, including a white ship captain who testified that he had employed Dixon occasionally since 1831, and a Black barber who said that he had known Dixon as a free man for 15 years. Walter Allender, Dixon's alleged owner, had to prove a difficult case. The slave called Jake had allegedly run away in 1832, and so none of his witnesses could claim to have seen this man for at least 5 years. Then, those witnesses had to prove that after all that time, they could identify one out of the 20,000 African-American people who lived in Baltimore. Judge Riker refused to deliver a prompt decision. He left Dixon to sit in a cell for 3 months. Perhaps Riker spent that time anxious that his decision might lead to more violence on the steps of City Hall. Finally, in July 1837, Dixon's lawyers secured a writ that allowed Dixon to go free on bail. Under the terms of this writ, Dixon would have to return to court if the judge called him, but in any subsequent hearings, a jury would determine his fate. This writ allowed Dixon to return to his life in New York, and it offered an important new layer of legal protection against enslavement. It seemed that Samuel Cornish and William Dixon and the NYCB lawyers had been right to obey the law in seeking protections for Black freedom. Judge Riker responded favorably to their arguments, and the case could set a valuable precedent for protecting other alleged fugitives in the time to come. In Dixon's story, we can see how people who were denied formal political rights were able to insert their voices and ideas into the spaces where laws were being made. In one sense, my book is all about stories like this. Free African Americans insisting that they should have a role in the lawmaking process and finding creative ways to push their way in. In New York, Black people learned the law and they risked their lives in defense of one another. These were two of the many ways they made themselves heard. Most of the Black folks in the crowd that rescued William Dixon wouldn't have been able to vote, so they figured out another way to express themselves. Before I wrap up, there's a little epilogue to Dixon's story that I'd like to share. It offers another angle on the ways Black people pursued justice in this period. After Dixon was released from jail, he lived in a state of anxiety. He could still be called back to court. He might be arrested again. He might be kidnapped again. His daily life was a tense experience. But perhaps no single encounter was more frightening than a chance meeting with a runaway slave from Maryland. In his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass described the morning he arrived in New York City in 1839. He disembarked from a train just after he had escaped slavery in Baltimore. Douglass was lost and lonely, wandering the streets of Lower Manhattan. So he felt overjoyed when he bumped into a Black man he remembered from Baltimore, a man he recognized as Allender's Jake. "I knew Jake well," Douglass wrote. He had heard that Dr. Allender had sent slave catchers after the runaway, but Douglass was glad. He was happy to see that Jake seemed to be thriving in freedom. As you might imagine, Jake was less than pleased to run into this old friend. He announced to Douglass, "I am William Dixon in New York," and he quickly walked away, leaving the more recent runaway alone in an unfamiliar city. Given what Douglas wrote about this encounter, it's worth considering a few more questions about William Dixon's story. Who knew the truth of Allender's Jake? The Black New Yorkers who tried to rescue him understood how difficult it was for any African American to secure freedom through the law. Regardless of whether they knew Dixon was Jake, they knew there were limits to the justice available to him as a Black man in court in New York, and they took steps to challenge that legal reality. Did the NYCB lawyers know that they were defending a fugitive? If they did, then Dixon and his legal team broke the law repeatedly, brazenly, from inside of New York City Hall. Their lawbreaking helped move toward a precedent that might create new legal protections for Black freedom. The lawyers recruited witnesses, Black and white, who were willing to lie in court in an effort to protect African Americans. For all his condemnation of the attempted rescue, it seems likely that Samuel Cornish, who was a leader in the NYCB, also knew the truth about Dixon. This might be why he was so angry about the City Hall mob. Perhaps he knew how much work had been done in court to create this character of William Dixon, to try to defend him. And Cornish was exasperated that a popular protest might disrupt this case. The legal case of the runaway slave Jake appears to have involved a series of acts of lawbreaking, multi-layered lawbreaking with profound political significance. Lawbreaking that took place both inside and outside of New York's City Hall. Finally, why did this man lie so ardently about his freedom? And why did he seem to think that this would work? Maybe this was a simple choice for a person who was desperate to be free. William Dixon was a character, a performance of freedom enacted in the courtroom and on the streets. It was a skillful performance, a high-wire act of lawbreaking. His story shows us how well Black people understood the law. It shows us how effectively they manipulated and moved through legal structures, making transformative claims about citizenship, rights, and justice. In the 1830s, African Americans navigated the legal landscape of New York, working in print, in court, and in the streets to transform a fugitive slave called Allender's Jake into a free man named William Dixon. All right, thank you for your time. I'm very happy to be able to share that work with you and to, I think, take some questions if folks would like to offer some. So I'm here.
Welcome back, Melanie. We have in our question box 2 questions already. Melanie, would you like me to read them, or would you like to take that on? I think you're muted.
Am I muted?
You're clear now.
Okay. So I was trying to see if the questions, Nick, but I don't know if I see them.
Okay, I can read them. The first one
Okay.
is, there was a significant population of free Blacks in New York for colonial times into the early 19th century. Can Professor Bonner please comment on the type of work these people did as well as their everyday social life? In addition, what was the reality of their everyday ability to bring change to their world?
So 2 big questions. What was free Black life like in New York? And what could they do to shape their circumstances? So in addition to there being a large population of free African Americans in New York, there were also a lot of slaves in New York from its beginnings as New Amsterdam under the Dutch and into its English colonial history. And a lot of the work that Black New Yorkers did, particularly in the colonial period, was the work of building the city. It was from the 17th century a city that was both an important commercial hub and also a place that was sort of trying to expand. And so building roads, building fences, tending livestock on the farms that were on what were then the outskirts of the city. These were all critical things that enslaved people were required to do in New York. And I think that kind of work continued into the 19th century when the free Black population of the city was growing. There were a lot of folks who were just doing work to cart trade goods from the docks to warehouses or from business to business. There was a lot of manual labor that was essential for making New York City the bustling commercial center that it was in William Dixon's time. And that's the kind of work that a lot of Black folks were required to do. In terms of what they could do to shape their circumstances, I guess one way to think about this is to think about the creation. I think that one of the important things about Black politics in this period is how much of it was about organizing and like forming groups like the New York Committee of Vigilance, or groups like the New York Free African Society, which was a sort of mutual aid organization where people would chip in dues, and if someone was in a circumstance where they needed money to pay rent, or they were unemployed for a time, they might be able to benefit from the fund in the society. There were organizations that were designed to foster Black education. There were Black churches. So there's all sorts of ways that the work that Black folks did was first coming together to look out for themselves. And then in these organizations where they were coming together, organizations like the NYCB, they would do things that were both trying to protect other African Americans, whether they were free or enslaved, and trying to ensure that the members of the group were able to work together to advance the interests of freedom or justice or equality. So I guess I would say collectivity is one of the really critical pieces of Black politics in New York and elsewhere in this period.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bonner. Here's the second question here. I would like Professor Bonner's response on the book Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, particularly his characterization of William Lloyd Garrison. I'm currently reading All on Fire by Henry Mayer, and would love Professor Bonner's reactions to that book as well. Thank you, Carolyn.
So confession time, I haven't had a chance to finish Professor Kendi's book. I mean, I can talk a bit about Garrison. I think my sense of, I imagine that perhaps part of what he's exploring are the ways in which Garrison as a radical abolitionist was also not actively anti-racist in a lot of ways. And I think that this is true. I think there are a lot of ways in which the relationship between Garrison and Frederick Douglass reveal the limits of Garrison's commitments to racial equality. There was this sense, I think that one of the things that Garrison said is, said to Douglass is like, you provide the emotional story and I'll provide the sort of intellectual framework to convince people that slavery is wrong. There was a sense in his work that Black people were capable of and should be doing certain kinds of anti-slavery stuff. And that there were intellectual aspects of it, publishing aspects of anti-slavery that people like Douglass should not be doing. And so this is part of, I think this is part of the eventual rift between the two men, Douglass's desire for his independence and Garrison's conviction that he as a white man should be in the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. Yeah, the book is on my shelf, but it's been a hectic few months, so I haven't quite gotten to it.
That's okay. It'll be on our list. Here's another one, Dr. Bonner. Cynthia writes, do you know if Mr. Dixon ever encountered Frederick Douglass again?
I don't know that. I wish I did. Doug doesn't write about it again. Douglass is actually really almost like hurt by this moment. It's terrifying for him to go to a new place and freedom for Douglass felt like, is this really what freedom is? He gets to New York and is alone and he doesn't really know what to do. And he's like, you know, he's amazed that he bumps into somebody that he knows. But in addition to telling Douglass, I'm William Dixon, leave me alone, what Dixon or Jake says to Douglass is, you have to watch out for slave catchers because they're everywhere. And sometimes they get Black folks to find or to root out fugitive slaves and then to tell on them, to bring the slave catchers in. So not only is Douglas abandoned, but he's also hearing terrifying information that he's in danger. And so it was a really, I say that to say that I think that if they had bumped into each other again, I think Douglas would have written about it. We don't really know what happened with Dixon after this meeting. There's evidence that for a time he went to Canada. The New York Committee of Vigilance writes a bit about, they use this sort of not very subtle code, and they say there was a certain passenger taken to Canada in the spring of 1837. And it's very clear that this is supposed to indicate William Dixon. And I think that there is this fear that as a fugitive slave, that's the safest place for him. And then there's some evidence to suggest that he returns later in the 1830s. But I suspect that, especially after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which really enhances the ability of slave catchers and slave owners to retrieve fugitives in the North, I suspect that Dixon might have gone back to Canada because he would have felt like that's the safest place for him. I mean, to be a fugitive slave and to have had such a close brush with being sent back to slavery, I think would have been tremendously frightening for him.
And just to tag on that, people are so interested in Mr. Dixon. Brenda says, does he remain free through the Civil War? So I'm assuming if he's in Canada.
As far as we know, he does. But, I guess, if I want to put on my optimistic hat, which I do kind of today, I'll say, yeah, I think that, a way to think about this is that, again, because it was such a major issue in the city, I think the Black newspapers would have written something about it. And Black folks would have been, again, up in arms if slave catchers had tried to capture him again. And so I like to think that he probably ended up free because we don't really hear that he was taken back or that he was arrested again.
Great.
Yeah.
We hope we'll be optimistic.
Yeah, right.
we need that in our life
right
now.
Yeah, definitely.
Just wanted to, I would be remiss if I didn't say that when you spoke about Freddie Gray and the Baltimore riots, that definitely firsthand experience that I had working in Baltimore in 2015 for the Pratt Free Library System as the manager of the Pennsylvania Avenue branch, which was definitely right in the epicenter of everything going on. There was so many emotions, so many things going on, so many things that we saw. You know, but the thing that came out of that, one of the things was I had a great conversation. We had StoryCorps to come to the library system, and they stayed with us for a couple of days and had a conversation with Vivian. I don't know if she's watching, but from the African American center at Pratt Central Library. I believe she has another position right now. But anyway, just talking about the 1968 riots versus the 2014-15, they wanted to call it uprising, and the difference in those terms, and the difference in what we saw from she growing up in 1968, seeing that, and for me, working, and that definitely brought out a lot of similarities and differences about, the feelings, the emotions, the reasoning why of that rage, like you said, and I think that is important to get to look at. But here's another question. You stated that Blacks knew the law. They knew what they were testing. How did they learn about the law? Was that a part of the benevolent societies and organizations that you mentioned? It seems quite interesting that in a time when survival seemed of foremost importance, learning the legal system is amazing, says Melinda.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the answer to your question is in that last line, right? I think that learning the legal system was essential for survival. I think that, a lot of how Dixon, Jake, surely came to understand the law and like this idea that, if he got a writ, he might be able to get a jury trial. Like he probably didn't know that intuitively or on his own. I think that that's probably something that came from the Vigilance Committee. But I think that in a lot of cases, African Americans, enslaved people, free and enslaved, they learned the law because the law had such a profound effect on their daily lives, right? If you're living free in New York, you know that you can't vote unless you own $250 worth of real estate. And so in order to live a fully free life, they would have to know that that was the law and then try to work against it or work around it or work through it to get what they wanted, right? And for enslaved people, they understood that the law said that if they were to possess a gun, or if they were to try to sell things that they had grown, or if they were to try to learn to read, or if they were to try to sit together in an informally organized church, then they might be prosecuted and punished both by their owners and by the legal structures, right? And so I think that Black folks learned the law because they knew how powerful the law had been, how decisive the law had been in shaping their lives. And they had to try to, keep understanding in order to improve their circumstances. I want to pull out, there's a quote that I use from Thurgood Marshall that's in the opening of my book. And I think it goes something like, across history, African Americans have been enslaved by law and emancipated by law, and then of course sort of segregated and discriminated against by law, and that they have understood that the path to equality is through the law as well, right? If the law is what is holding you down, knowing the law is really powerful in order to try to raise yourself and other African Americans up. I can't pull it. I'm not going to say that I'm quoting, Justice Marshall, but it's something along those lines.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that, Dr. Bonner. We're close to 10 minutes into the end of our presentation this evening. I want to thank you so much for everything, all of your hard work, and keep it coming. I'm sure you're probably working on something else, and I know that's a question that people always ask.
Yeah. I am working on a new piece, another story, a story of a guy named Moses Grandy who was enslaved in early 19th century Virginia and North Carolina. And what's compelling about Grandy is that he had skills as a boat navigator and was able to make money and negotiate with his owner to try to purchase his freedom. And so he does this and pays the owner, and the owner takes the money and sells him to someone else. And then Grandy does it again. The second owner takes the money and sells him to someone else. And so he ends up essentially paying for himself 3 times before he's able to actually secure his freedom. And so I'm really interested in that. I'm interested in thinking about how African Americans tried to do that kind of thing, how they would try to work to, and what it meant that they were working to make money to pay a slave owner to free themselves. So that's kind of the direction I'm going now. That's my summer job.
That sounds great. Good work.
Yeah.
Good work coming. Good work coming. We got one more. Let's see. How common were cases such as Mr. Dixon's? A handful a year, hundreds? This is from John.
I wish I could say something off the top of my head. I guess that if we're thinking about how common incidents like the attempted rescue were, they weren't particularly common. There are a handful, maybe a dozen or so, that historians have written about across the antebellum period in Massachusetts. There's a riot in Christiana, Pennsylvania. There's the rescue of Jerry in Syracuse and Anthony Burns in Massachusetts. There are some particularly famous cases where abolitionists, Black and white, tried to rescue enslaved people. And I write about a couple more of these in my book as well. In terms of legal proceedings, I think that there were probably more like a few dozen a year, just based on what I've seen in the records of the vigilance committees and in the newspapers. I mean, at the same time, if you're looking through the pages of the Colored American, at the same time that you're seeing these reports about William Dixon, there are parallel reports about another case that's happening in New York at the same time. And so I think the best recent estimate is that somewhere around 1,000 enslaved people escaped the South and made it to the North each year after about 1830. And so we could estimate that probably at any given time, a few dozen of those people would have found themselves caught up in legal proceedings because slave owners were so desperate to get back their property.
Great. And we've got questions coming and comments. Let's see. Cynthia says, this has been a fascinating presentation. During college, I worked at the Black History Museum in Hempstead, New York. I'm learning so much about the state where I was born and have returned to live. So thank you, Cynthia, for your comment. I think Dr. Bonner already answered this question about his next project, right? You did say.
Yeah, I hope so. I would say I don't want to give anything more away, but the truth is I don't really have that much more to give. So, it's a work in progress.
So Bianca, keep looking out for it. Maybe within 2021. We'll push him along. Yeah. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Bonner, so much for joining us tonight. And the name of the book that we were talking about tonight was Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship. So we appreciate you being our second guest author for the Office of Truth series. We look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you for having me. It's been terrific.
Yes, and seeing you hopefully coming past the Oxon Hill branch. When we open up to see the Sojourner Truth Room.
Yeah,
if you never visited. Take care. Thank you.
Thank
and
you so
I also want to say that this evening was sponsored by the PGCMS Foundation. Nick alluded to that earlier. You can see the donations box in green there. Donations to the foundation support programs like the Office for Truth and the work of our 19 branch libraries. So I hope people consider making a donation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Thanks also to our partner libraries, Anne Arundel County, Calvert, Carroll County, Howard County, and the Pratt, and anyone else who I missed. It's been really great partnering with you, and congratulations to Dr. Bonner on your promotion to assistant professor, which I know was recent, and thank you to Melanie and Shelley for hosting this program. Good night, everyone.